At dawn, in Ouagadougou, 2 clocks began to tick, and with them the future of a nation trembled in the balance. From Washington came a demand, sharp and merciless. Within 48 hours, Burkina Faso must surrender 60% of its gold and oil. If it refused, the dollar lifeline would be cut. Banking channels would freeze, international transfers would collapse, and the nation's economy would suffocate under invisible chains. No appeals, no negotiation, only obedience or punishment. By nightfall, Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, answered with his own decree. 72 hours. That was the time limit he gave for foreign companies to comply with new Burkinabe laws. They had to sign agreements recognizing national authority, or their permits, fields, and pipelines would be shut down. No exceptions, no extensions. For the first time, a small, landlocked country stared at a superpower and set its own clock. The world held its breath as the minutes passed. On one wall hung the countdown from Washington's ultimatum. On another, the 72-hour timer began its march. Both clocks threatened. Both clocks promised pain. Yet only one could prevail. This was not a stage play. It was not political theater. Already trucks idled at checkpoints. Banks tested transfers, waiting to see if the wires would still hum. Inside offices, lawyers drafted exit strategies for multinational corporations. In the ministries of Ouagadougou, fluorescent lights burned late as officials stamped directives, sealed orders, and dispatched couriers to every mine. Every action mattered. Every order carried risk. And in the markets, the courtyards, and the bus stops, ordinary citizens listened to radios with growing tension. Neighbors whispered about which clock would win. Would the 48-hour demand from Washington break their nation? 6s. Or would the 72-hour ultimatum of their president hold fast and reshape history? 6s. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was never just a question of gold or oil. It was about dignity. For generations, contracts had been signed abroad, draining resources while families endured poverty at home. Now a new line was drawn in the sand. The test of sovereignty was no longer a matter of promises. It was measured in hours. Hour 1 had begun. And every minute from that dawn carried not just economic risk, but the weight of a nation's destiny. When Washington's ultimatum landed, many around the world expected hesitation or retreat from Burkina Faso. They assumed the government would scramble for negotiations, that fear would drive leaders into concessions. But Ibrahim Traoré did not pause. He moved swiftly, as if the demand had been anticipated. There were no long public speeches, no dramatic rallies. Instead, there were orders. 5 directives were issued, clear and precise. First, all gold and oil exports were frozen until new agreements were signed. Second, every mining site was placed under audit to verify compliance with national law. Third, foreign security teams at the mines were ordered to stand down and be replaced by Burkinabe forces. Fourth, control of all information technology and data servers was seized and transferred to Ouagadougou. Fifth, all mining data, including production figures and export records, was directed into secure national servers. Couriers carried sealed packets to company headquarters across the country. Phones rang, offices grew silent, and foreign managers read the new terms. At the first mining site, an IT director refused to hand over server credentials. A state officer walked in, placed a suspension notice on his desk, and collected the keys. Within hours, the data streams were redirected to secure nodes in the capital. The balance of authority had shifted. At another site, unmanned aerial drones buzzed above the ground, recording stockpiles from the sky. Trucks that had been preparing to leave were grounded until their cargo matched the new national manifests. That evening, one convoy attempted to push through a checkpoint at dusk. Papers did not align. Engines were turned off. The trucks were escorted back under guard. By the 24th hour, reports flooded into the control room. 2 foreign operators had signed the new agreements without resistance. One hesitated, asking for arbitration. Another threatened to withdraw completely, calculating that Washington's 48-hour clock would rescue them. The 72-hour order was not a slogan anymore. It was enforcement in real time. In villages, news traveled quickly by radio. Elders gathered around wooden benches in courtyards to listen. Bus stations buzzed with updates. People asked which companies had complied and which resisted. For them, the countdown was not an abstract political standoff. It was a new reality shaping the future of their families. By nightfall, resistance became visible. A fire erupted at a fuel depot. Investigators quickly concluded it was sabotage. Inside the ministries, 2 officials were dismissed after suspicious transfers tied to foreign accounts were uncovered. Convoys of trucks stalled between checkpoints, caught between the old rules of international contracts and the new national directives. Every hour felt like a stress test. Yet resilience grew alongside the tension. Miners volunteered to guard stockpiles overnight. Young engineers took consumer drones and rewired them into surveillance tools, creating a live feed network that watched storage yards and roadways. Villages opened local radio frequencies to deliver direct alerts if sabotage was detected. It was crude. It was improvised. But it worked. The gaps in the system closed faster than they opened. At hour 20, the control center filled with color-coded markers. Green for compliance, yellow for review, red for resistance. The map of the nation flickered with shifting signals, but the red zones began to shrink. For the first time, the 72-hour order felt less like a gamble and more like a system in motion. Then hour 32 arrived. Banks tested international transfers routed through New York. The transactions failed. The wires were blocked. Panic, quiet but unmistakable, spread through the control room. This was the 48-hour ultimatum in action. The pressure point had arrived. No exports, no revenue, no access to dollar channels. The arteries of the economy were choking. Traore did not flinch. He ordered backup settlement routes. Regional banks in the Sahel were activated. Gold for grain swaps were authorized. Payments shifted into barter with neighboring countries. It was rough and imperfect, but it kept oxygen in the system. Everyone in the room knew the stakes. If the 48-hour cutoff held, the 72-hour ultimatum could collapse in practice, even if it remained on paper. This was no longer a symbolic standoff. It was a collision of systems, one built on American financial power and the other built on Burkinabe sovereignty. And whichever system held through the night would shape the future. Hour 45 arrived, and the tension in Ouagadougou could be felt in every street. Radios blared with competing stories. Foreign broadcasters declared that Burkina Faso was isolated, cut off, and facing inevitable collapse. National stations countered with messages of determination, insisting that the transition to state control was progressing on schedule. In the markets, shopkeepers counted smaller stacks of currency. Miners waited for their wages. Truck drivers sat on idling engines, wondering if their fuel would last until dawn. The entire country lived between two ticking clocks. Inside the presidential compound, Traore convened his closest advisors. The reports were brutal but honest. Payment systems routed through New York had been blocked. 2 foreign companies announced withdrawal. Sabotage attempts continued to emerge, with investigators racing to trace money trails back to suspicious contractors. Yet alongside the bad news were sparks of resilience. Domestic banks were successfully processing regional trades. Gold swaps with Sahel partners had cleared. Villages were standing guard over depots at night, protecting resources with their own hands. Fragile, but real. At hour 47, Washington's deadline loomed. Analysts predicted that the dollar cutoff would slam shut within minutes. Traders whispered of collapse. Then a courier rushed into the control center with unexpected news. The People's Resource Fund had received its first direct deposit. Gold had been delivered and exchanged without passing through dollar channels. The transaction cleared. The room erupted in cheers. It was not a total victory, but it was proof that life could continue outside the American system. Survival was possible. Now the 2 clocks collided. The 48-hour demand had cut one artery. The 72-hour order had built another. Neither side had won. Neither side had broken. But for the first time, it was clear that Burkina Faso was not defenseless. At hour 50, the pressure deepened. Banks confirmed frozen transfers. Foreign companies suspended operations until payment channels were restored. International headlines declared a collapse already underway. Traders speculated against Burkina Faso's currency. Prices climbed. Fuel lines grew longer. Yet inside the control room, Traore did not bend. He ordered the release of emergency stipends for miners, paid not in dollars but in gold-backed credits usable in local markets. Foreign media mocked the measure as primitive, but miners in towns like Kaya held their pay slips and said, "At least we are still working." Villagers cheered when trucks rerouted through Sahel. Partners arrived with grain. Crude solutions, but effective ones. Hour 55 brought confrontation. A sabotage team attempting to tamper with a power substation was caught and arrested. Images of the capture spread across the nation within hours. For the people, it was proof that enemies existed, but also proof that the state could fight back. For the government, it was validation that the 72-hour order was not simply a decree, but a functioning law enforced on the ground. Inside the control center, advisors debated whether to provide relief to non-compliant companies in hopes of retaining production. Traore silenced the discussion with a single decision. "This is a sovereignty test," he said. "If they cannot operate under our law, they will not operate here." His words were broadcast that evening and repeated in tea shops, courtyards, and markets. It was a statement of principle that turned anxiety into cautious pride. Hour 60 arrived. The world expected collapse. Foreign outlets ran headlines of Burkina Faso on the brink. Analysts predicted a run on reserves. Traders bet against the nation's survival. Yet the system, though battered, still breathed. It was not stable, but it had not broken. And then came the twist that no one had foreseen. At dawn, a joint statement emerged from Bamako and Niamey. Mali and Niger declared a coordinated guarantee. If Burkina Faso's dollar channels remained frozen, The Sahel alliance would provide immediate settlement in gold and regional currencies. Convoys of grain, fuel, and medicine were already loaded. Trucks rolled toward Burkina Faso's borders. Cameras captured the first vehicles crossing under escort, horns blaring, villagers lining the roads and cheering. The message was silent, but powerful. Burkina Faso was no longer fighting alone. It was defended by allies. For the first time since the confrontation began, it was Washington's ultimatum that looked fragile. The 48-hour demand was designed to isolate one nation. Instead, it had fused a regional bloc. The story had changed. For the people of Burkina Faso, the battle between two clocks was not an abstract standoff. It was lived in daily struggles. In Ouagadougou, the price of bread rose sharply. At fuel stations, lines stretched down the streets as families waited for hours to fill small containers. In the mining towns, wages were uncertain until Traoré's government began issuing gold-backed credits. Parents explained to their children why food cost more, why electricity flickered, why cash seemed scarce. Yet they also explained something deeper. For the first time in decades, their country was not surrendering. It was resisting. In Kaya, miners stood watch over stockpiles, rifles slung over shoulders, determined that no foreign operator would remove gold without permission. In small villages, elders organized patrols at night to guard depots of grain and fuel. Radio stations carried constant updates, not only from the capital, but also from local communities reporting sabotage attempts, compliance successes, and new arrests. What began as an order from the president became a national movement to enforce sovereignty hour by hour. This experience changed the way citizens saw their role. It was no longer only the responsibility of government officials. Ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and students began to see themselves as guardians of independence. Even small acts mattered. A farmer reported unusual truck movements. A teacher in a rural school shared news bulletins with families who lacked radios. Young engineers experimented with ways to improve drone surveillance. Every contribution, no matter how small, became part of a broader shield. Politically, the ultimatum cut deep into the old system. Two high-ranking officials linked to suspicious foreign transfers were removed from office within days. That decision sent a clear message. Corruption would not be tolerated in the midst of a sovereignty crisis. Members of parliament who had once been cautious began to speak more boldly in defense of national authority. The ultimatum, intended to divide the government, instead hardened its unity. The crisis also pushed Burkina Faso closer to its neighbors. Mali and Niger, already aligned in the Sahel bloc, became active partners rather than symbolic allies. Their decision to send convoys of food and fuel created a visible demonstration of regional solidarity. This cooperation carried political weight. For years, the Sahel had been seen as fragile, fragmented, and vulnerable. Now it appeared as a bloc willing to stand together under pressure. Internationally, the optics shifted as well. Images of villagers cheering the arrival of Sahel convoys spread on social media. Video clips of miners holding payslips in gold-backed credits circulated online. These were not stories of collapse. They were stories of survival, of people finding ways to adapt under unprecedented strain. Inside Burkina Faso, the ultimatum produced reforms at a speed that peacetime politics never allowed. The government accelerated efforts to settle transactions in regional currencies. Plans for a sovereign digital payment system were pushed forward. Talks with neighboring banks advanced quickly. By necessity, the economy began to reshape itself in days rather than years. The effects reached into family life. In many households, evening discussions revolved around the clocks, the new laws, and the convoys from Mali and Niger. Children learned to see sovereignty not as an abstract word, but as something tangible, measured in whether their lights stayed on, whether their parents received wages, and whether grain arrived on time. Parents told them this was a lesson in dignity. Even when life was harder, it was worth enduring if it meant not being controlled from abroad. The 72-hour ultimatum also changed the tone of political debate. Opposition figures who had criticized Traore now found themselves in a difficult position. To attack the order meant appearing to side with foreign powers. To support it meant conceding that Traore had rallied the nation. Many chose silence. Some, however, shifted their stance and publicly defended the policy. For the first time, sovereignty became a point of consensus across political lines. By the time the deadline approached, the mood of the country had changed. The fear of collapse had not disappeared. Prices were still high. Transfers were still blocked. But what had begun as panic had transformed into defiance. Burkina Faso had proven that it could enforce its own laws, punish sabotage, and survive under sanctions long enough to rally regional allies. The ultimatum was meant to break the nation. Instead, it revealed its resilience. It exposed corruption, tested loyalty, and forged unity. In the villages and in the capital, people began to believe that sovereignty was not a fragile dream, but a daily discipline. The 72-hour order had forced every citizen to confront the cost of independence. And many decided that the cost was worth paying. In Washington, the 48-hour ultimatum was designed as a show of overwhelming force. It was meant to remind the world that access to the dollar remained the ultimate weapon. Yet the outcome did not match the expectation. Instead of folding, Burkina Faso endured. Analysts on American networks admitted reluctantly that the cutoff had not broken the system. For the first time in decades, a small nation had challenged the financial dominance of the United States and remained standing. In Paris and Brussels, headlines were sharp and critical. European officials framed Burkina Faso's decision as reckless and dangerous. Yet behind closed doors, concern grew. If one small country could survive a direct financial strike, what would stop others from attempting the same? Sixes. Questions circulated in policy circles. Could the European Union maintain influence in Africa if nations began turning to regional alliances instead of international lenders? Sixes. Across Africa, the message spread like wildfire. From Dakar to Bamako, citizens discussed Burkina Faso's stand as if it were their own. Some called it the 72-hour revolution. Others spoke of it as the Sahel doctrine. The details of gold-backed credits or regional swaps mattered less than the symbolism. For millions, the event proved that a nation did not always have to bow when threatened by global powers. In Asia and South America, the story also attracted attention. Governments already exploring alternatives to the dollar system studied Burkina Faso's moves with interest. Could regional blocs create their own shields against financial coercion? Sixes. Could barter and local currencies create breathing space for economies under pressure? Sixes. Burkina Faso's defiance became a case study, a living experiment in resistance. For global markets, the ultimatum was a shock. Traders who had bet against Burkina Faso were forced to recalculate when the country refused to collapse. Investors realized that political will and regional alliances could sometimes outweigh financial pressure. Above all, the confrontation shifted perception. The United States was still powerful, but no longer untouchable. A small, landlocked country in West Africa had stood its ground under immense pressure, and by doing so, it had planted doubt in the minds of allies and adversaries alike. If Burkina Faso could endure, what might happen if larger nations chose to follow its example? 6s. Hour 72 arrived. The clocks stopped, but instead of silence, the streets of Ouagadougou filled with sound. Markets opened, radios played victory songs, and children waved flags in the morning sun. The collapse predicted by foreign analysts never came. Against all odds, the 72-hour order stood, while the 48-hour ultimatum faded into noise. Standing before his people, Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation with steady resolve. "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and we made it real. Our gold, our oil, our land are no longer decided abroad. Sovereignty is not theory. It is action, enforced hour by hour, until no ultimatum can touch us." His words carried across radios, through courtyards, and into the hearts of millions who had endured the tension of the clocks. For Burkina Faso, this was more than survival. It was the beginning of a new foundation. Miners received wages. Convoys delivered food and medicine. Families guarded what was theirs. For the Sahel, it was proof that regional unity could withstand external pressure. For the world, it was a reminder that even the smallest nations can change the balance of power when they refuse to bow. Yet the warning was clear. Victories in sovereignty are never final. Sanctions may deepen. Sabotage may return. External pressure will not disappear overnight. Freedom must be defended daily, not only in government halls, but in households, markets, and fields. What Burkina Faso proved is that sovereignty is possible when discipline meets courage. So the question lingers for all of us. Was this merely a 72-hour survival, or the birth of a new era in Africa's awakening? 6s. For older generations in America, the lesson may feel familiar. Many remember the Cold War, when freedom was tested by pressure. Many recall the Civil Rights Movement, when dignity was defended against odds. The imagery may differ, but the heartbeat is the same. 4s. People refusing to live on someone else's terms. If this story has touched you, let your voice be heard. Share your thoughts in the comments. Speak of what freedom means in your life. Carry this story further than any ultimatum can reach, because freedom is never granted by the powerful. It is claimed by the determined. May God bless Burkina Faso. May God bless Africa. And may the spirit of sovereignty remind us all that even the smallest clock, if it keeps ticking, can outlast empires.